We are in week 2 of our study of this book of Galatians that we're calling Free. And so we started last week. We read through chapter 1. We read from chapter 1, verse 1, all the way to chapter 2, verse 10. So we're kind of picking it up in the middle of chapter 2. And I'm just so glad that we get to unpack this a little bit more in this series called Free. Now, I love the way that Heather read this passage. You did such a good job, Heather, because there's so much to unpack in this. But we have to kind of review last week to understand what's happening this week. So last week we started talking about this letter that Paul wrote to this church in Galatia. And he's writing to them as the father of this church, the spiritual father, the founder of this church. And he's trying to deal with significant issues that are going on in the church. And he speaks to it right away. And last week we looked at what is the problem that's going on in the church. And it was that there was this group of Gentiles, those who were not born Jewish, who had come to faith in Jesus as the Messiah. And they were following Jesus. There was this other group of Jewish believers that were born Jewish, and they came to faith that Jesus was the Messiah. That was great that you got these two groups that are experiencing the love of God, experiencing the freedom and forgiveness that comes through Jesus. The problem is that some new Jewish believers were saying to the Gentiles, hey, you've got to now adopt all of our traditions that we used to have and the law of the Old Testament as well as Jesus. And last week we looked at where Paul is like, no, that's not the gospel. That's not the story of Jesus. That's not the truth of that Jesus came to set us free. You can't take the old obsolete system that Jesus completed and now bring that into the new system. And he's saying that's not the gospel. It's not Jesus plus the law. It's not Jesus plus the regulations like circumcision. It's Jesus and our faith in Jesus alone. That's what truly sets us free. Don't take, and as Paul talks about here, the hard bondage that the law can bring, because Paul was like, we never could satisfy that. We never could satisfy the law. The law was there to show us what sin was, not to remove sin from us. Only Jesus can do that. And so that's where we're picking it up, that Paul started last week saying, this is the issue. And it was so pervasive that Paul is now gonna say this next bit from verse 11. He's explaining that in chapter 1, and then chapter 2, verse 10. And then in verse 11, he says, but when Peter came to Antioch, Peter, you guys know through the Gospels, was one of Jesus' 12 disciples. He was a follower of Jesus. Jesus said that he would build his church upon the rock of Peter's profession of faith. And Peter was instrumental at the beginning of the birth of the church. He was in the upper room at Pentecost when Peter preached a message in Jerusalem. 3,000 people get saved and the church was birthed. That Peter was a founder and a pillar of the church. He was one of the church elders and apostles. And so this is really important because Paul is saying, but when Peter came to Antioch, part of Galatia, he said, I had to oppose him to his face, for what he did was very wrong. When he first arrived, he ate with Gentile believers. Why is that significant? Because for Jewish people by birth, to eat with Gentiles was forbidden in the Old Testament law. But now Peter said he was eating with them as a sign of embracing them, of allowing them into his world. For a Jewish person to share a meal was saying, I'm sharing my life with you. And so when Peter first came, he was hanging out with the Gentiles, these new believers in Jesus. He was embracing them as his own, but continue. They were not circumcised because they weren't Jews, but afterwards, where some friends of James came, Peter wouldn't eat with the Gentiles anymore. He was afraid of criticism from these people who insisted on the necessity of circumcision. So Peter was hanging out with them, was embracing them, was including them as equal co-heirs with Christ. But then some other people, the circumcision group, as what gets called, that is not, a group you want to be, like, you don't want that on a sweatshirt, right? Like, but they start showing up with influence. And Peter's afraid of criticism. How many of you have ever been afraid of criticism? Yeah. And Paul's like, I had to oppose him. Now, Paul is just giving a summary of his confrontation with Peter. He's not giving you all the details. He's not giving you all the process that's there. But Paul's saying, basically, even Peter, who did the right thing because of fear of criticism, messed up, made a mistake. And I had to deal with it. And I opposed him to his face. He even says later on, he said other Jewish believers were following Peter's hypocrisy. That's a strong word. And even Barnabas, who's one of Paul's closest friends, was led astray by their hypocrisy. When I saw that they were not following the truth of the gospel message, I said to Peter in front of all the others, hey, you're Jewish by birth and have discarded the Jewish laws and are living like a Gentile. Why are you now trying to make these Gentiles follow Jewish tradition? Paul is saying, I had to remind Peter that you can't embrace the gospel of grace through Christ alone and embrace a gospel of rules and laws that Jesus made obsolete anymore. So, we're going to look at a couple different principles in this passage that we can apply today. And the first one is this. I'm so glad that Paul includes this in his letter. Because he didn't have to, but he's really just trying to say, even Peter messed up. Even Peter was denying the power of the gospel in his actions, although he may not in his message. There's a couple of things I just want to point out that we need to know in 21st century America or its sanctuary right now. And the first one is this. There are no perfect churches and no perfect leaders. Now, that may be news to some of you. Can I just say, if you've been in a church for more than 5 minutes, you know this to be true, right? How many of you know that there are no perfect churches and no perfect leaders? Great. I had a professor who used to say, hey, if you find a perfect church, don't join it because you'll mess it up. Peter and Paul were great leaders. They had great character. They had great love for Jesus. They actually both independently birthed great churches, but they were not perfect. They had to deal with this issue that was there. Paul had to confront Peter. He had to deal with this situation. And why this is really important, it sounds, so obvious. Because I've heard it from many people, and I've seen it within myself, that even though we know this is true, sometimes don't we really expect to find maybe not a perfect church with perfect leaders, but when we see the imperfections, we kind of like, oh man, so discouraged, so disappointed. We're like, oh, it shouldn't be this way. If we're really followers of Jesus, it should be like heaven on earth all the time, even in our relationships. And our leaders should be like the perfect shepherds and the perfect example of Jesus all the time. Can I just say, don't be surprised that the church in community of faith that you find yourselves in, and the leaders around you, they will not be perfect. They won't be perfect. There will be problems in every church and every community of faith you belong to. That's reality. If I just burst your bubble, I'm really sorry. The church, the community, the people, and the leaders will not be perfect. And here's a surprise, either will you. Either will you. Paul loved Peter. And Paul also loved his church and the people that were in his church. Paul loved Peter and his people enough not to avoid the problem and Peter's mistake and his bad choices. You know, I love this because I actually think Paul's response is saying, Peter, you're worth confronting. And the people that you're kind of leading as a bad example, they're worth dealing with this subject too. Why? Because Paul knew that the essence of the gospel that sets us free was at stake. Can I tell you? I believe in the gospel of grace. I preach the gospel of grace, but it is so easy sometimes to slip in patterns of behavior and even embrace traditions that may have been used by God in the past to forsake the freedom and what God is doing based in his truth for us right here, right now. Even Peter, the pillar of faith, Jesus' chosen person to build his church, made mistakes. You know, Paul found it worth it to confront Peter. You know, there's a truth that I've had to learn and I'm still learning. It's this, that healthy people do healthy confrontation. Let me say that again. Healthy people do healthy confrontation. And here's the truth. If there's no perfect church with no perfect leaders, and it's true that healthy people do healthy confrontation, then healthy churches will need to learn how to do healthy confrontation as well. You know, I believed growing up and probably even into my adulthood that confrontation, if I were to be honest, I believed inside of me, and I knew it wasn't true, but I felt it was true, is that confrontation leads to division. Confrontation leads to breakdown. But I've learned that healthy people do healthy confrontation. And I've now believed the truth, and I have to remind myself of this, is that healthy confrontation brings potential growth and even deeper connection. I'm gonna say that again. I'm looking at some blank faces like you're struggling. Is this true as well? That healthy confrontation brings potential growth and even deeper connection. Can I tell you, Paul confronting Peter, and Peter changes. Peter, he's reminded. And the church in Galatia didn't fall off the map because of this. It's because healthy confrontation done God's way leads to potential growth that God has. And it leads to actual deeper connection if it's done well. It's risky, but it needs to be done well. The problem is most of us have never seen healthy confrontation. We've never experienced healthy confrontation. We may have never been taught how do you handle conflict or deal with healthy confrontation in a way that can lead to results. Some of you, when I use the word confrontation, you're already getting triggered. Am I right? I keep saying the word and you're like, oh no, please change the subject. Can we go back and talk about circumcision again? Like that's you know, anything. Circumcision is less cringy than confrontation. I want to share with you some practical points on how to do healthy confrontation. Now, I'm gonna let you know right now that Carrie and I actually tag teamed and taught on this stuff probably 2 years ago. So if some of you are like, wow, that sounds strangely familiar, it's because it is for those of you who were around 2 years ago. But it's still true today, and we all need a healthy reminder of it. And this last point I know is true, but it's discouraging to me, is that even if you were there, you probably don't remember it two and a half years ago. Let's be honest, you may not remember what we talked about 2.5 weeks ago. If you're like me, 2.5 minutes ago. So for some of this is gonna be review, and so I wanna share a couple tips to healthy confrontation. Because, and I'm serious with this question, how many of you want healthy relationships? How many of you want a healthy church and a healthy community? Okay, can I tell you, healthy confrontation is unavoidable to see that take place. So let's learn how to do it together. Is that all right? So, a couple points. All right, we'll start with the first one. Before you're do the healthy confrontation, before you talk to a brother or sister or someone in your life that you have to deal with, let's define confrontation. The first thing is this: confrontation is addressing and dealing with issues that are hurting the person or the relationship or God's desire and plan for them. Can I say that again? It's addressing and dealing with issues that are hurting the person, the relationship, or God's greatest desire for you and for them. It's dealing with issues that maybe they're not dealing with or you need to deal with that actually may be hurting them or you or maybe even others. And that's what Paul's talking about here. He's like, hey, Peter, you're hurting yourself. You're hurting this church. You're hurting the gospel of Jesus. You're hurting Jesus' plan and reputation. And we got to deal with this. And Paul is speaking as a loving brother to Peter, but he's also a loving father to this church he's dealing with. And he's like, no, I have to deal with this. Because if I don't, I'm not loving and leading well. So that's what it's addressing and dealing with issues. So the first thing is this: when you need to deal with confrontation, deal with healthy confrontation, you need to deal with something that's addressing an issue in someone's life in a relationship. The first thing is this: examine your own heart and life patterns. This is really important. Don't skip this part. You need to pray for the person. You need to pray for what's going on in your heart. You need to examine why is this bothering you? You need to examine your own heart. Jesus even says hey, before you tell your brother about the speck of sin in their eye, deal with the log in your own eye. In other words, examine yourself. Don't be so quick to judge others that you don't also let God speak to you. Examine your heart and also life patterns, because let's admit it, we all have patterns of dealing with issues or not dealing with issues. So part of it in dealing with healthy confrontation and learning how to be a person that does this well is examine your own heart about the issue or about the person, but also look at your life patterns. How do you handle conflict? How do you handle issues? When they're there, do you let offense get into your heart? And then maybe offense becomes unforgiveness, and unforgiveness becomes bitterness. And so, do you have a track record when issues arise in others and people around you and in relationships with people that are in your life? Do you harbor offense that leading to unforgiveness and bitterness? If that's a pattern for you, you need to deal with that too, as part of healthy relationships and confrontation. Do you struggle with anger? Let me ask you a question. Does drama in conflict follow you? Do you have a pattern for drama in your life? Do you look at your past relationships, your friendships, and you're like, I don't understand it. There's always drama in my life. You're the common denominator, right? You get that, right? You may need to deal with some hard issues and patterns in life. Doesn't matter what church I go to, it always pops up. You're the problem, or at least part of it. Let me ask you this question that you need to ask yourself. How does your family dealing with confrontation affect how you deal with confrontation? Because the first place you learn how to deal with conflict is at home. Because if you're part of a family of whatever shape, size, or you will deal with conflict. And how does your family deal with conflict? How does they deal with confrontation? Was it a healthy patterns? Because you'll probably perpetuate those unless you learn something different. Or you've been impacted by unhealthy confrontation that you'll take those maladaptive responses with you. How's that for a big word? How do you respond when people have confronted you? When people have to deal with an issue with you, what's your response? Is it defensiveness? Is it anger? Is it like you retreat? Do you cancel them? Do you have this fight or flight instinct where you become aggressive, or you run away and cower with fear and you don't deal with it? Do you become avoidant? Do you start brooding when someone confronts you? And, Carrie talks about this. Does this inner dialogue start happening of victims and villains, and you're the victim and they're the villain in the scenarios? Learning what your unhealthy responses are can help to examine your heart to start walking out new patterns of healthy confrontation. All of us have unhealthy patterns that we need to deal with and learn how to handle this. Okay, I was gonna say if there's any questions, but I don't wanna have confrontation right now. No, I'm just joking. So examine your own heart. The second thing, clarify the issue. Clarify the issue. What is the issue? Paul's clear, like, Peter, you used to eat with the Gentiles and embrace them as the gospel of grace, but now you're living in fear. You're actually being a hypocrite. You're actually modeling something that we're not modeling. You're not modeling what Jesus modeled. Jesus was accused of eating and drinking with sinners. Jesus modeled embracing people that were excluded. He never condoned what they did. He never, and Russ did a great job talking about this a couple of weeks ago. His compassion never led to his condoning of sinful actions, but his compassion led him to at least engage with them and embrace them and love them where they were at. But clarify the issue. What is the issue going on? You've ever been in confrontation where you walked out of it going, I don't even know what we were really talking about? You ever had confrontation over someone and it's like, I think we just had an argument about laundry, but I don't think it really is about laundry. They seemed really mad because I left a towel on the ground. Is that the issue, or is there a deeper issue? Or why am I getting so upset when they leave the toilet seat up? Yeah. Oh, Lord, help everyone who deals with that issue. No, what's the deeper issue? Is it about the toilet seat, or is it about feeling disrespected or unlistened to? Make sense? Anyone? Does that make sense to anyone? Okay, great. Toilet seat people are struggling. All right. Clarify the issue, because can I tell you what the real issue is? If you don't deal with it, it's just gonna keep coming back up. The toilet seat's gonna be about the toilet paper being under and over, and it's gonna be about, the issue will keep changing because you're not dealing with the issue, clarifying what's going on inside of you and inside of the relationship. I'm using lighthearted examples when usually sometimes it's bigger than that. But can I tell you, if you don't learn how to deal with confrontation on the small stuff, the bigger stuff you'll never get to. Clarify the issue. Third, you need to choose truth-telling over peacekeeping. Truth-telling over peacekeeping. Now, we're gonna talk a little bit more about what that looks like a little bit later. Did I skip one? No. Truth-telling over peacekeeping. Some of us, if you're like me, are people pleasers, and you would rather keep the current comfort level of the relationship than actually choose to tell the truth to the person and deal with the issue. And if you're gonna do healthy confrontation that leads to potential growth and even further connection, you're gonna have to risk the current comfort level of the relationship to speak the truth in love, to deal with the issues, to bring greater growth. That one's really scary for us, because some of us, if we're to be honest, would rather keep the peace than speak the truth. The problem is the issues will keep coming up, and at that point, you'll either disconnect formally or just emotionally in your heart from that person. And in our cancel culture will lead to complete disconnection, but it doesn't have to. You know, some of us are afraid of their response so much that we're unwilling to talk through it. And I can tell you, there is no guarantee on how they're gonna respond. And that's not your responsibility. It was not Paul's responsibility for Peter's response. It was Paul's responsibility to do the right thing, to bring up the issue. That's scary for us who would rather choose peacekeeping. There's others of us who have no problem messing with peace to deal with issues. You know, and we have to learn there's a difference between assertiveness and aggression. Some people thrive off of conflict and confrontation. You ever seen those people? Yeah. They thrive off of conflict and drama and aggression. But really what they're not looking for is healthy confrontation. What they're looking for is to control you, to get you to do what makes them feel comfortable. All right. Fourth thing, affirm the relationship. Affirm the relationship. When you have to deal with this with the person, can I encourage you to start with, hey, I really value our friendship. I value our relationship. I value you as a person. And it's because I do that I want to bring this up. And I'm a little scared and I'm risking right now hurting you or maybe your response. I'm risking the current comfort level of a relationship, but I wanna let you know that this relationship is really important to me. You're really important to me. And that's why I'm doing this. And I'm scared or I'm nervous and I don't really wanna bring this up, or I wanna make sure I do this in a healthy way. I wanna do this in a way that leads to connection and growth. That really helps to affirm the relationship. They need to hear it, because sometimes even if you're doing it right, you're coming in with the right heart, they may not know what you're feeling towards them. And maybe they're afraid of the issue. And maybe their maladaptive responses will get surfaced because they're feeling defensive or they're feeling attacked, or they may not know that you actually really care about them and why you bring it up. Or maybe in their family, if you brought up issues, it did not go well. And so just be prepared to affirm the relationship. Okay, next one. Ready? Are you guys all right? Okay. Wow, ready? Speak the truth in love and avoid right fighting. Speak the truth in love and avoid right fighting. We're gonna put those two together. And Paul writes to the church in Ephesus, later on, in Ephesians 4:15, he says, instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. Let me read that again. Instead, speaking the truth in love. Some of us have no problem speaking what we think is truth or speaking the truth, but it doesn't come across in love. Love should be the motivation of why you're having the conflict. I fully believe that Paul loved Peter. He loved his church and he loved the Lord. I believe that Paul was motivated by love, even in opposition to Peter. I believe that. If you look at Paul's other interactions, you see his love for the Lord and for others in there. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every aspect a mature body of him. If we can learn how to do this, if we can from love and in love and communicate in love, our healthy confrontation can lead to personal growth and communal growth and growth in Christ. Do we believe this? So speak the truth in love in a way that would honor Christ. Love needs to be the motivation in the tone in our conversation. Love looks like honor. And when even someone's confronting you, you need to speak the truth in love as well. Don't be defensive or speak in a way that will bring defensiveness if it's possible. And don't do right fighting. You ever been around a right fighter? That they're just gonna keep fighting until, because they believe they're right. And they're gonna fight for their right and to be right. Have you ever known someone that even if they were right about the issue, they were wrong in their attitude and approach? And have you ever been around someone who will become really defensive that they're really right and end up leading to hurt and woundedness? Can I say that I struggle with this in my marriage with Carrie? That there was sometimes, a lot of times, a need to be right. And there will be times where you have to agree to disagree. But I really struggle with that because I wanted to agree that I was right. And sometimes I would right fight instead of speaking in love and with honor in a way that maybe I was absolutely right. Not maybe, most of the time. No, I'm just joking. I've learned in almost 26 years of marriage that most of the time Carrie's right. But even if I am right, I can be wrong and hurt her and hurt our relationship. If being right to you is more important than the other person you're dealing with, go back to number one, examine your own heart. Examine your own heart. Because if anyone was right and deserved to be defensive in his approach to people, it was Jesus. He was attacked regularly. He was judged regularly. He was lied about. And Jesus didn't respond with right fighting. Even when he explained or defended himself, you'll see Jesus speak the truth in love. Don't pick right fighting. Can I tell you, if you have two people or even one person that is right fighting in the situation, no one really wins. No one really wins. You may have won an argument, but you didn't win the heart of God in the situation. Okay. Can I encourage you? Here's a practical one that I have to learn. I versus you messages. Okay? Let me explain that. If you start with, you know what your problem is? Or you always do this, and you never do this, and you should do this, and things like that. I don't care what the issue is, you're not gonna get a good response. When you start with you statements, you're provoking a defensiveness. You're provoking hurt. Instead, start with you. And here's a good method that I've learned. Ready? I feel, fill in the blank, when, fill in the blank, because, fill in the blank. So I'll give you an example. I feel hurt and dismissed. That's how I'm feeling. I feel hurt and dismissed when, fill in the blank, when we hang out and you are on your phone. I know that would never happen to anyone in this room. Let me say it again. I feel hurt and dismissed when we hang out and you are on your phone because I want to connect with you, and it makes it hard if you're distracted by a screen. Did you catch that? If that's a little different than you're always on your screen, you're always distracted, you never spend any time with me, you never pay attention to me. Even if you're right, that's like an attack. Everyone understand that? But if you could start with, hey, I feel hurt. Now, you may need to go back to one, examine and then clarify the issue. Why do I get so upset when they're on their phone? What's going on inside of me when that takes place? Why does that bother me, but it doesn't seem to bother their other friends? Or maybe it does, but they're unwilling to have the conversation. Okay. Here's one that I've had to have. Real life example. I feel a certain amount of negativity and even distance from you in my heart when you respond with sarcasm that feels a bit biting, because it makes me feel like you don't really respect or care about me. Now, I'm not accusing them of not caring about me. I'm just explaining how it makes me feel. And I feel like I need to share that. That maybe other people, their sarcasm doesn't bother them. Or again, maybe we become so used to that form of humor that we think it's normal and it doesn't have an effect. But I need to explain, I'm feeling distance from you whenever you're responding in that way because I don't feel like you really respect me. Or the negativity that comes from that level of sarcasm doesn't draw me to you. It actually repels me. Real life example. I've had to have that conversation. I've had to deal with that. Here's another one. Small issue, but I've had to have this conversation. I often feel frustrated, and even if I were to be honest, a little bit disrespected every time we're supposed to meet and you're always late. Or maybe I shouldn't have said you're always late. When you have been late. I feel frustrated because probably inside I feel like you don't care enough to make sure that you care about me enough to make sure that our time together is protected. Now, that person may not say, oh, I'm going to be late because I don't really care about Kevin or respect his time. I'm just letting them know how I feel when that happens. And then I can let them respond. And they'll probably say like, hey, I'm so sorry. I don't mean to that to happen. I get distracted. And I can say, totally understand. But I'm like, I need to let you know how it makes me feel and how it actually hurts our relationship. Because I want to hang out. I want to get together. I want to talk through whatever's going on in your life. But often when you're late, we're already starting this meeting where I'm feeling like, oh man, there's something that I'm bringing into the meeting that I don't want to be there. So we need to talk about it. Make sense? We good? All right. Last one. Revisit the issue if needed. Follow up the conversation. Follow up with even after you're dealing with the conflict or the issue, follow up by just saying, affirm the relationship again. Just say, hey, I know that was a tough or awkward conversation. I want to check in. How are we doing? How are you doing? Is there anything that we need to look at again? Now that you've processed, because I probably had a process going into the conversation. Now that you've processed the conversation, how are you feeling about it? Do we need to have part 2? That's okay. Can I tell you, Carrie and I, we've had to have part 2, 300. Yeah, that's scary. Because sometimes it's a process. And so be willing to revisit the issue to say, and then explain how you're feeling. Bring encouragement when you see some change or effort, or when you're like, oh, I actually feel a lot closer to you now after dealing with this issue. I feel encouraged by that. And then address the issue again if problems continue. If Peter had continued in that situation, I trust that Paul would have said, Peter, come on. We know what Jesus has asked us to do, and we need to embrace these people. We want to see our communities be a place where grace and freedom abound. Okay, cool. All right. I know that was probably overload of information. But the title of this series is called Free. And if we're going to walk in the freedom that Jesus has for us, doing relationships will mean that we're going to have to deal with some stuff. Because sometimes my brokenness bumps into yours. my ongoing journey with Jesus, I'm not fully mature and haven't completely arrived yet. I still make mistakes. I'm still dealing with stuff. And we want to be able to walk that out together, don't we? Someone say amen or yes or okay, great. Yeah. Why don't you stand up? I just want to bless you guys in this. Yeah. Sanctuary, I bless you in Jesus' name. With healing into the deep places of your soul, your heart, and your mind, where unhealthy confrontation left scars or mindsets or paradigms that Jesus wants to heal and set you free of. I bless you, each and every one of you, to know the love and grace of Jesus in your own life, that you'll be able to extend it to others in healthy relationship. I bless each and every one of us to be slow to anger, quick to listen, and abounding in grace towards each other. I bless you, Sanctuary, to learn God's heart, to speak his truth in love in a way that leads to growth and deeper connection and blessing, that we may mature in Christ Jesus and for his glory. And Sanctuary, I bless you that the truth of God's heart for you and for your friendships and relationships and community will blow up every lie you believe about healthy confrontation. And last thing, I bless us to be a community that walks this out well, that Jesus would be glorified, and that eternity would be changed in the hearts of others when they see us model his heart and grace and love. Amen? Amen.